Have you ever noticed that curious paradox? How the more religious institutions grow in power, the more spirituality seems to wither. It's one of those contradictions hiding in plain sight, so deeply embedded in our cultural landscape that we rarely pause to question it. Consider the pattern. Magnificent cathedrals rising as mystical experience declines, religious authorities multiplying as genuine spiritual connection fades, theological systems expanding as direct divine encounter recedes. There's something almost suspicious about this inverse relationship. Why would the very institutions claiming to represent God seem to make direct experience of the divine increasingly rare? The contradiction extends beyond mere observation into historical pattern. The early Christian communities, with their emphasis on direct spiritual experience, gradually transformed into rigid ecclesiastical hierarchies, claiming exclusive authority to mediate divine truth. The living mystery at the heart of religious experience calcified into fixed dogmas requiring obedient acceptance rather than personal encounter. The God who reportedly spoke directly to prophets became increasingly distant, accessible only through official institutional channels. There's something curious about this evolution, a suspicious correlation that warrants deeper investigation. This paradox becomes even more intriguing when we notice how consistently religious institutions respond to genuine spiritual innovation. From mystics frequently viewed with suspicion to spiritual innovators often condemned as heretics, the pattern repeats. Direct divine experience that bypasses institutional mediation is systematically marginalized, controlled, or suppressed. There's something almost too convenient about this pattern, as if institutions ostensibly dedicated to connecting humans with God actually function to regulate and control that connection in ways that preserve institutional power. The uncomfortable question lurking beneath this pattern is disturbing. What if religious institutions don't primarily function to connect humans with God, but rather to control and mediate that connection in ways that serve institutional interests? What if the Church, far from preserving divine presence, has systematically transformed living mystery into dead dogma, direct encounter into institutional obedience, living spirit into rigid letter? What if the very institution claiming to represent God has been the primary force in making authentic divine experience increasingly inaccessible? This isn't merely an academic question. It strikes at the heart of Western spirituality, challenging our most basic assumptions about religious institutions and their relationship to divine reality. If the Church has functioned not primarily to preserve divine presence, but to domesticate it into forms that serve institutional power, how might this distort our understanding of God, spirituality, and authentic religious experience? What might become possible if we distinguished between institutional religion and the direct spiritual experience it claims to represent? And who better to guide us through this uncomfortable territory than a man who spent his life examining the psychological foundations of religious belief, a philosopher whose father and grandfathers were Lutheran pastors, giving him intimate knowledge of religious institutions from the inside, a thinker whose commitment to intellectual honesty led him to question not just specific theological claims, but the very role of religious institutions in mediating divine reality. What if I told you that over a century ago, one of history's most penetrating minds uncovered this pattern and traced its implications to their unsettling conclusion? A thinker who recognized that behind his era's growing atheism lurked something far more disturbing, not the simple rejection of God, but the gradual killing of divine reality through its institutional domestication. What might we learn by following his investigation? Why do we find it so difficult to distinguish between God and the institutions claiming to represent him? Could it be that centuries of institutional conditioning have deliberately blurred this distinction? What if the most profound spiritual insight isn't finding God through the Church but recovering divine possibility beyond its institutional domestication? The answers to these questions might challenge your most basic assumptions about God, religion, and spirituality. They offer a perspective on divine reality, not as something best accessed through institutional mediation, but as living mystery systematically obscured by the very institutions claiming to preserve it. Are you ready to follow where they lead? There's a striking pattern in religious history that becomes visible once you start looking for it. A pattern so consistent it can't be dismissed as coincidence. It emerges in the peculiar transformation that occurs when direct spiritual experience becomes institutionalized. The living mystery gradually calcifies into rigid doctrine. The dynamic encounter slowly hardens into fixed ritual. The immediate presence steadily retreats behind institutional mediation. This pattern doesn't appear randomly. It follows a specific and predictable trajectory, revealing itself most clearly in how religious institutions systematically transform divine mystery into institutional property. Consider how spiritual revelation typically evolves. It begins with direct, often disruptive spiritual experience that bypasses existing religious authorities. Think of Moses at the burning bush, Jesus in the wilderness, Buddha under the Bodhi tree, Muhammad in the cave of Hira, each encountering divine reality directly, without institutional mediation. Yet within generations, these immediate encounters transform into religious systems that increasingly emphasize correct belief over direct experience, institutional authority over personal revelation, fixed tradition over ongoing encounter. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Institutions gradually claim exclusive authority to mediate the very divine reality that originally bypassed institutional channels entirely. What makes this pattern truly revealing isn't its occasional appearance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse religious traditions. The specific theological details may change, the cultural expressions may shift, but the psychological and sociological function remains strikingly consistent. Direct divine encounter gradually becomes subject to institutional control, with religious authorities increasingly positioning themselves as necessary mediators of spiritual reality. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. This pattern becomes even more intriguing when we notice how it manifests in religious language. Words and concepts initially used to describe ineffable spiritual experience gradually transform into technical theological terms, requiring expert interpretation. The language of immediate encounter slowly evolves into specialized vocabulary, accessible only to the institutionally trained. The direct pointing to transcendent reality steadily becomes an elaborate doctrinal system, requiring official explanation. The pattern continues. Language originally meant to evoke divine presence increasingly functions to establish institutional authority over that presence. The anomaly extends beyond language into ritual and practice. Spiritual practices initially designed to facilitate direct divine encounter gradually transform into institutional ceremonies that primarily signify religious identity and reinforce ecclesiastical authority. The purpose shifts from creating openness to transcendent reality to ensuring proper religious belonging and correct doctrinal understanding. The pattern repeats. Practices originally intended to access divine reality increasingly function to regulate and control that access through institutional channels. What's particularly striking about this pattern is how rarely we acknowledge it explicitly. We discuss religious history, theological development, and institutional evolution at length, but we seldom examine this specific correlation. How consistently the institutionalization of spiritual experience coincides with the gradual receding of direct divine encounter. It's as if we've collectively agreed not to notice how religious institutions systematically transform the God they claim to represent. And that's where our investigation truly begins, with the recognition that religious institutions might be serving functions quite different from those explicitly claimed. What if the Church hasn't primarily preserved divine presence, but systematically transformed it into forms that serve institutional interests? What if God hasn't simply been forgotten or rejected by secular society, but actively killed through his institutional domestication? What if the famous phrase, "God is dead," points not primarily to atheistic rejection, but to a more disturbing reality, the gradual killing of divine mystery through its institutional transformation? This is the question that haunted a 19th century philosopher whose insights into religious psychology were so profound, so disturbing, that they continue to challenge us today. A man who dared to ask whether our growing inability to experience divine reality might be caused not primarily by scientific materialism, but by the very institutions claiming to preserve that reality. What did Friedrich Nietzsche discover about this strange relationship between religious institutions and the divine reality they claim to represent? And why does his discovery remain so unsettling and potentially liberating more than a century later? What if God didn't simply die of natural causes but was systematically killed by the very institution claiming to keep him alive? This question leads us to Nietzsche's disturbing insight. God is dead, and we have killed him with our lies about him. In the spring of 1882, Friedrich Nietzsche published a book that would contain one of his most famous and frequently misunderstood declarations. God is dead. The book was The Gay Science, and the declaration appeared in a section titled The Madman, describing a figure who runs into a marketplace announcing God's death to indifferent crowds. At 38, Nietzsche was still largely unrecognized by the intellectual establishment despite having published several works of profound philosophical insight. His health was deteriorating. Severe migraines, stomach ailments, and failing eyesight regularly confined him to darkened rooms for days. It was within this context of physical suffering and public indifference that Nietzsche formulated his most penetrating insights about the relationship between religious institutions and divine reality. His personal circumstances provided a unique vantage point from which to examine this relationship. Having grown up as the son of a Lutheran pastor, with both grandfathers also pastors, Nietzsche had intimate knowledge of religious institutions from the inside. He was raised in an environment saturated with institutional Christianity, where God was supposedly central yet increasingly experienced as distant and abstract rather than immediately present. Yet his own intellectual journey had led him to question whether this distance might be caused not by divine absence, but by institutional mediation, whether God had become increasingly inaccessible not despite religious institutions, but because of them. What made Nietzsche's perspective on divine reality especially valuable wasn't merely his philosophical brilliance, but the convergence of his personal experience with his intellectual journey. Here was a man who had been immersed in institutional Christianity from childhood, yet possessed the rare intellectual courage to question its fundamental assumptions. Each day, as he navigated both his physical pain and his intellectual isolation, Nietzsche lived the very question at the heart of his philosophy. Might divine reality be obscured rather than revealed by the very institutions claiming to represent it? Could spiritual truth be more accessible outside institutional frameworks than within them? During his periods of relative physical relief, Nietzsche would write in small notebooks, developing what would become one of his most disturbing insights, that the famous phrase, "God is dead," pointed not primarily to atheistic rejection of divine reality, but to something far more disturbing, the gradual killing of God through his institutional domestication. The death of God wasn't simply the result of scientific materialism or secular philosophy, but the perhaps inevitable consequence of transforming living mystery into dead dogma, immediate presence into institutional property, direct encounter into regulated system. In his notebooks from this period, filled with his increasingly aphoristic writing style, Nietzsche began to articulate a disturbing hypothesis, that religious institutions hadn't primarily preserved divine reality, but systematically transformed it into forms that serve institutional interests rather than spiritual awakening. As he would later write in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "Once the people said God when they looked upon distant seas, but now I have taught you to say, over man." This wasn't mere atheistic declaration, but recognition that institutional domestication had made traditional conceptions of God increasingly unbelievable, necessitating new understanding of transcendent possibility beyond institutional mediation. What made this insight especially powerful was that it didn't come from anti-religious animus, but from Nietzsche's meticulous analysis of how religious institutions actually function in human experience. He noticed something that few had articulated before: how consistently the institutionalization of spiritual experience coincides with the gradual receding of direct, divine encounter. This wasn't mere coincidence, but revealed something profound about the psychological and sociological function of religious institutions, not primarily preserving divine presence, but regulating and controlling access to transcendent reality in ways that serve institutional interests. It was this recognition of the hidden function of religious institutions that gave Nietzsche's spiritual critique its unusual penetration and emotional force. He wasn't merely rejecting God as delusion, he was uncovering what he saw as the true process by which divine reality had become increasingly inaccessible, not through simple rejection, but through systematic institutional transformation. As he would write in The Antichrist, "In Christianity, neither morality nor religion come into contact with reality at any point." This wasn't mere polemic, but recognition of what Nietzsche saw as Christianity's fundamental problem. Its institutional structures had increasingly separated believers from direct encounter with both spiritual reality and lived human experience. This is the context from which Nietzsche would develop his unsettling analysis of how God had been killed by the very institution claiming to represent him. It wasn't merely a critique of specific theological claims, but a profound insight into how religious institutions relate to the divine reality they claim to represent. What evidence did Nietzsche find for this disturbing pattern? And what implications might it have for our understanding of God, religion, and the possibility of authentic spiritual experience beyond institutional mediation? Nietzsche's first evidence for his hypothesis came through his meticulous examination of religious history and institutional development. With the careful eye of a trained philologist, he traced how divine reality was progressively transformed through institutional mediation across Western religious history. What he discovered was a striking pattern that few had bothered to notice. The systematic institutional domestication of God from living mystery into fixed doctrine, from immediate presence into distant abstraction, from direct encounter into regulated system. In The Gay Science, published in 1882, Nietzsche offered his initial observations of this pattern through the famous parable of the madman. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the gravediggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? Gods too decompose. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that God's death wasn't simply the result of atheistic rejection, but something far more disturbing: the gradual killing of divine reality through its institutional transformation into forms increasingly disconnected from living experience. What made this observation so penetrating wasn't merely identifying growing secularism, which many had acknowledged before, but recognizing its specific cause: how religious institutions had systematically transformed God from living reality into abstract concept, from immediate presence into distant authority, from direct experience into theological system. The death of God wasn't simply intellectual rejection, but the perhaps inevitable consequence of this institutional domestication, the gradual transformation of divine reality into forms increasingly disconnected from lived human experience. Nietzsche found evidence for this pattern in how Christianity had evolved from its origins. He noted how the early Christian emphasis on direct spiritual experience and living community gradually transformed into rigid ecclesiastical hierarchy, claiming exclusive authority to mediate divine truth. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Institutional structures increasingly positioned themselves as necessary intermediaries between believers and divine reality, transforming direct encounter into regulated system requiring official interpretation and approval. This insight gained further support from Nietzsche's analysis of how divine language evolved through institutional mediation. He noticed how words and concepts initially used to describe ineffable spiritual experience gradually transformed into technical theological terms requiring expert interpretation. The language of immediate encounter slowly evolved into specialized vocabulary, accessible only to the institutionally trained. The pattern continued. Language originally meant to evoke divine presence increasingly functioned to establish institutional authority over that presence. Perhaps most compelling was Nietzsche's observation of how divine attributes themselves evolved through institutional transformation. In Human, All Too Human, he writes, "When one gives up Christian belief, one thereby deprives oneself of the right to Christian morality. Christianity is a system, a consistently thought out and complete view of things. If one breaks out of it a fundamental idea, the belief in God, one thereby breaks the whole thing to pieces. One has nothing of any consequence left in one's hands." This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that God hadn't been rejected simply as isolated concept, but as integral element of an institutional system that had progressively transformed divine reality into abstract principle, increasingly disconnected from lived experience. This observation allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that religious institutions hadn't primarily preserved divine presence, but systematically transformed it into forms that serve institutional interests rather than spiritual awakening. As he writes in The Antichrist, "The very word Christianity is a misunderstanding. At bottom there was only one Christian, and he died on the cross." This isn't mere provocative rhetoric, but recognition that institutional Christianity had progressively transformed Jesus' direct spiritual understanding into a regulatory system that often functioned contrary to his original vision. What makes this evidence so compelling isn't any single instance, but the consistent pattern across religious history and institutional development. The same correlation appears again and again. The institutionalization of spiritual experience consistently coincides with the gradual receding of direct divine encounter. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. As Nietzsche deepened his investigation, he discovered that the relationship between institutional religion and divine reality wasn't merely historical curiosity, but fundamental pattern in how transcendent possibility becomes progressively domesticated. The specific theological details might change across religious traditions, but the basic psychological and sociological process remained consistent. Living mystery gradually calcifies into rigid doctrine. Dynamic encounter slowly hardens into fixed ritual. Immediate presence steadily retreats behind institutional mediation. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, published between 1883 and 1885, Nietzsche expanded this analysis. God is a conjecture, but I desire that your conjectures should be limited by what is thinkable. Could you think a God? But this is what the will to truth should mean to you, that everything be transformed into what is humanly thinkable, humanly visible, humanly feelable. You should think through your own senses to their consequences. This passage reveals Nietzsche's understanding that institutional religion doesn't primarily preserve divine mystery, but progressively transforms it into humanly manageable forms, domesticating transcendent possibility into conceptual systems that serve institutional interests rather than spiritual awakening. What made this insight especially powerful was Nietzsche's recognition that this process wasn't merely theoretical, but revealed itself in lived religious experience. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "The Christian faith from the beginning is sacrifice, the sacrifice of all freedom, all pride, all self-confidence of spirit. It is at the same time subjection, self-derision, and self-mutilation." This isn't mere polemic, but recognition that institutional Christianity had progressively transformed direct spiritual possibility into regulated system that often required surrendering the very faculties, freedom, pride, self-confidence, through which authentic spiritual experience might occur. Nietzsche began to see that this pattern revealed something essential about how religious institutions function psychologically and sociologically, not primarily to preserve divine presence, but to regulate and control access to transcendent reality in ways that serve institutional interests. By transforming God from living mystery into abstract principle requiring official interpretation, from immediate presence into distant authority requiring institutional mediation, religious institutions effectively ensure their own continued relevance, while simultaneously making direct divine encounter increasingly rare. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most disturbing insights, that the death of God wasn't simply philosophical conclusion, but psychological and cultural reality created largely by the very institutions claiming to keep him alive. As he writes in The Gay Science, "After Buddha was dead, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave, a tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown." This isn't mere atheistic declaration, but profound cultural observation. Even as living divine reality becomes increasingly inaccessible through institutional mediation, religious institutions continue displaying its shadow. the conceptual remnants of what was once immediate spiritual experience. The pattern became increasingly clear. Religious institutions hadn't primarily preserved divine presence, but systematically transformed it into forms that serve institutional interests rather than spiritual awakening. The God who reportedly spoke directly to prophets had gradually become abstract principle, requiring official interpretation. The divine reality supposedly encountered in immediate experience had steadily retreated behind institutional mediation. The living mystery at the heart of spiritual life had progressively calcified into fixed dogmas, requiring obedient acceptance rather than direct engagement. This insight allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that the growing inability to experience God as living reality wasn't primarily caused by scientific materialism or secular philosophy, but by the very institutions claiming to preserve divine presence. As he writes in The Antichrist, "I call Christianity the one great curse, the one great intrinsic depravity. I call it the one immortal blemish of mankind." This isn't mere rhetorical excess, but recognition that institutional Christianity had progressively transformed divine reality into forms increasingly disconnected from lived human experience, effectively killing God while claiming to represent him. What implications might this understanding have for our relationship to divine reality, religious institutions, and the possibility of authentic spiritual experience? And what might it reveal about the possibility of encountering transcendent reality beyond institutional mediation? Nietzsche's investigation was leading him toward a disturbing conclusion: that God hadn't simply been forgotten or rejected by secular society, but actively killed through his institutional domestication. That the very institutions claiming to preserve divine presence had been the primary agents in making that presence increasingly inaccessible. As Nietzsche continued his investigation, a striking pattern emerged across diverse aspects of religious history and institutional development. The domestication of divine reality wasn't isolated to particular theological details or specific religious practices, but appeared with remarkable consistency throughout the evolution of institutional religion. The pattern was clear. Living mystery gradually calcifies into rigid doctrine. Dynamic encounter slowly hardens into fixed ritual. Immediate presence steadily retreats behind institutional mediation. A systematic transformation that effectively kills divine reality while ostensibly preserving it. In The Antichrist, published posthumously in 1895 but written in 1888, Nietzsche articulated this pattern with characteristic clarity. The very word Christianity is a misunderstanding. At bottom, there was only one Christian, and he died on the cross. This passage reveals his recognition that institutional Christianity hadn't primarily preserved Jesus' spiritual vision, but systematically transformed it into something quite different. Religious system that often functioned contrary to his original message. The pattern continued. Institutional mediation doesn't simply preserve spiritual vision, but inevitably transforms it in ways that serve institutional interests rather than spiritual awakening. The pattern revealed itself in how divine attributes evolved through institutional development. The God of direct prophetic encounter, who reportedly spoke through burning bushes and still small voices, gradually transformed into abstract theological principle increasingly accessible only through official institutional channels. The divine reality supposedly experienced in immediate spiritual awareness steadily retreated behind complex theological systems requiring expert interpretation. The pattern continued. God himself evolved through institutional mediation, from living presence into abstract concept increasingly disconnected from direct human experience. In religious language, the same pattern appeared. Words and concepts initially used to describe ineffable spiritual experience gradually transformed into technical theological terms requiring official explanation. The language of immediate encounter slowly evolved into specialized vocabulary, marking religious identity and establishing institutional authority. The pattern persisted. Religious language increasingly functioned not to facilitate divine encounter, but to regulate and control access to transcendent reality through institutional channels. Perhaps most revealing was how this pattern manifested in religious epistemology. the way divine knowledge is understood to be acquired. The early religious emphasis on direct spiritual experience, personal revelation, and immediate divine encounter gradually transformed into increasing reliance on institutional authority, official interpretation, and correct doctrinal understanding. The pattern repeated. Knowledge of God increasingly came not through personal experience, but through acceptance of institutionally approved teachings. What made this pattern so powerful wasn't any single instance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse aspects of religious development. Whether in theological concepts, ritual practices, institutional structures, or spiritual epistemology, the same psychological and sociological process operated. Direct divine encounter gradually became subject to institutional control, with religious authorities increasingly positioning themselves as necessary mediators of spiritual reality. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, every church is a stone rolled onto the grave of a godlike person. It seeks to prevent him from rising again. This isn't mere polemic, but recognition of how religious institutions systematically transform the very divine reality they claim to preserve. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most penetrating insights, that the death of God wasn't primarily caused by atheistic philosophy or scientific materialism, but by the very institutions claiming to keep him alive. God hadn't simply been rejected by secular thought, but gradually killed through his institutional domestication, transformed from living reality into abstract concept, from immediate presence into distant authority, from direct experience into theological system. The very process of institutionalizing divine reality had made that reality increasingly inaccessible to direct human experience. As this pattern became increasingly clear, Nietzsche began to recognize its profound implications. What if religious institutions haven't primarily preserved divine presence, but systematically transformed it into forms that serve institutional interests rather than spiritual awakening? What if God hasn't simply been forgotten or rejected by secular society, but actively killed through his institutional domestication? What if authentic spiritual experience might now be more accessible outside institutional frameworks than within them? This recognition wasn't merely academic observation, but profound challenge to how we understand divine reality, religious institutions, and the possibility of authentic spiritual experience. If God has been killed largely through his institutional domestication, what might become possible if we sought spiritual understanding beyond institutional mediation? What aspects of divine reality might again become accessible if we distinguished between God himself and the institutions claiming to represent him? What form of spiritual understanding might emerge beyond the theological systems that have both preserved and distorted our conception of divine reality? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore the deeper implications of Nietzsche's discovery. What does it mean for our understanding of God, religion, and the possibility of authentic spiritual experience beyond institutional mediation? And what might it reveal about the possibility of encountering transcendent reality in a world where traditional conceptions of God have become increasingly unbelievable? The implications of Nietzsche's discovery reach far beyond academic religious criticism into the very heart of how we understand divine reality and spiritual possibility. If God has been killed largely through his institutional domestication, then addressing this situation requires more than theological refinement. It demands fundamental reconsideration of our approach to transcendent reality, not merely revised doctrine, but transformed understanding of how divine presence might be encountered beyond institutional mediation. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche explored these implications through his concept of the death of God, not merely as cultural event, but as potential opening to new spiritual possibility. God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. And we still have to vanquish his shadow too. This passage reveals Nietzsche's profound insight. The death of institutionally mediated God doesn't necessarily mean the end of spiritual possibility, but might actually create opening for more authentic divine encounter beyond the shadows of institutional religion. The first profound implication is theological. If God has been killed largely through his institutional domestication, authentic understanding of divine reality might require moving beyond traditional theological systems. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, "What does your conscience say? You shall become the person you are." This isn't mere self-help slogan, but profound spiritual insight. Divine reality might be encountered not primarily through institutional doctrine, but through authentic engagement with one's deepest nature. Not through theological abstraction, but through lived human experience in all its complexity and contradiction. The second implication is epistemological. If knowledge of God has become increasingly mediated through institutional authority, authentic spiritual understanding might emerge through different knowing altogether. As Nietzsche suggests in Beyond Good and Evil, there are heights of the soul from which even tragedy ceases to look tragic. This isn't mere aesthetic observation, but recognition that spiritual knowing might operate through direct intuition rather than doctrinal acceptance, through immediate awareness rather than institutional mediation, through lived experience rather than theological system. The third implication is practical. If divine presence has steadily retreated behind institutional structure, authentic spiritual experience might require a different approach to practice. As Nietzsche writes in The Antichrist, "What is good? Everything that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? Everything that proceeds from weakness." This isn't crude celebration of dominance, but recognition that spiritual practice might involve strengthening rather than weakening human capacity, enhancing rather than diminishing the very faculties through which transcendent possibility might be directly experienced. Perhaps the most profound implication is liberatory. If God has been effectively killed through his institutional transformation, authentic spiritual possibility might require liberation from the very systems claiming to preserve divine reality. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "I love him who wants to create beyond himself and thus perishes." This isn't mere provocative rhetoric, but recognition that authentic spiritual understanding might emerge beyond the theological frameworks that have both preserved and distorted our conception of divine reality. That new spiritual possibility might become accessible precisely through the death of institutionally mediated God. What does this mean for our understanding of divine reality, religious institutions, and the possibility of authentic spiritual experience? If God has been killed largely through his institutional domestication, what might become possible if we sought spiritual understanding beyond institutional mediation? What aspects of divine reality might again become accessible if we distinguished between God himself and the institutions claiming to represent him? What form of spiritual understanding might emerge beyond the theological systems that have both preserved and distorted our conception of transcendent possibility? As Nietzsche suggests, the path toward authentic spiritual understanding begins not with more perfect theological system, but with recognition of how institutional mediation has progressively obscured direct divine encounter. The death of institutionally mediated God might actually create opening for more authentic spiritual possibility, not through rejection of divine reality itself, but through liberation from the systems that have both preserved and distorted our conception of that reality. The collapse of traditional theological frameworks, though initially experienced as crisis, might ultimately reveal itself as opportunity for renewed spiritual understanding beyond institutional constraints. The pattern Nietzsche uncovered extends beyond specific religious details into what might be called a conspiracy of mediation, a collective cultural agreement to transform direct spiritual experience into institutionally regulated system. This isn't a conscious conspiracy in the crude sense, but rather a cultural evolution driven by the fundamental interests of institutional religion itself. Religious institutions inevitably transform the very divine reality they claim to represent, precisely because institutional survival requires domesticating transcendent mystery into manageable forms that ensure continued institutional relevance. In On the Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887, Nietzsche traced how this conspiracy evolved through the historical development of religious institutions. What began as direct spiritual encounter gradually transformed into complex theological systems requiring official interpretation. Immediate divine presence steadily retreated behind institutional mediation, living mystery progressively calcified into fixed dogmas requiring obedient acceptance rather than direct engagement. The specific theological details changed across religious history, but the basic psychological and sociological process remained consistent. Religious institutions inevitably transform transcendent mystery into manageable forms that secure their own continued relevance. This cultural evolution wasn't driven by malicious intent, but by the fundamental nature of institutional religion itself. As Nietzsche writes in The Antichrist, "Whoever is a teacher through and through takes all things seriously only in relation to his students, even himself." This isn't mere criticism of hypocrisy, but recognition that religious institutions inevitably approach divine reality primarily as teaching to be transmitted rather than mystery to be directly encountered. The very function of institutional religion requires transforming ineffable experience into communicable doctrine, immediate presence into established tradition, direct encounter into regulated system. What makes this pattern particularly compelling is how it manifests across seemingly different aspects of religious life. Theological systems transform divine mystery into conceptual frameworks requiring official interpretation. Ritual practices convert direct spiritual experience into regulated ceremonies, marking religious identity. Institutional hierarchies establish themselves as necessary mediators between believers and divine reality. Each domain develops its own language, but the basic psychological and sociological function remains consistent: the progressive institutional domestication of transcendent mystery into manageable forms. The conspiracy extends into how we conceptualize spiritual growth itself, often framing it primarily as increasing acceptance of institutional teaching rather than deepening direct experience. It appears in how we approach divine knowledge, frequently emphasizing correct doctrine over immediate awareness. It emerges in how we understand spiritual authority, commonly locating it in institutional office rather than authentic experience. The pattern persists. Religious life increasingly centers around institutional mediation rather than direct divine encounter. What makes this pattern so powerful isn't any single manifestation, but its remarkable adaptability across diverse religious contexts. As specific theological details evolve, the same basic psychological and sociological process continues. Religious institutions position themselves as necessary mediators of divine reality, progressively transforming direct spiritual possibility into institutionally regulated system. Different theological content, same basic institutional function, the domestication of transcendent mystery into manageable forms that secure continued institutional relevance. This recognition reveals something profound about the nature of institutional religion, that it operates according to inherent logic, largely independent of its specific theological claims. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, "Every church is a stone rolled onto the grave of a godlike person. It seeks to prevent him from rising again." This isn't mere polemic, but recognition of how religious institutions function sociologically, not primarily preserving direct spiritual possibility, but regulating and controlling access to transcendent reality in ways that ensure their own continued relevance. Nietzsche's penetrating insight wasn't merely that God had been killed, but that this killing was perhaps inevitable consequence of institutionalizing spiritual experience. The very process of organizing divine encounter into religious system necessarily transforms living mystery into fixed doctrine, immediate presence into distant abstraction, direct experience into regulated tradition. The real conspiracy isn't specific theological content, but the deeper cultural pattern of transforming direct spiritual possibility into institutionally mediated system, process that effectively kills divine reality while ostensibly preserving it. This pattern raises profound questions about religious institutions, spiritual possibility, and the nature of divine reality itself. If God has been killed largely through his institutional domestication, what might become possible if we sought spiritual understanding beyond institutional mediation? What aspects of divine reality might again become? This pattern raises profound questions about religious institutions, spiritual possibility, and the nature of divine reality itself. If God has been killed largely through his institutional domestication, What might become possible if we sought spiritual understanding beyond institutional mediation? What aspects of divine reality might again become accessible if we distinguished between God himself and the institutions claiming to represent him? What form of spiritual life might emerge beyond the theological systems that have both preserved and distorted our conception of transcendent possibility? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore why this pattern has remained largely unacknowledged and what it might mean for the possibility of authentic spiritual understanding in a world where traditional conceptions of God have become increasingly unbelievable. Why has the institutional killing of God remained largely unacknowledged despite its profound implications for religious understanding? The answer isn't a conscious cover-up, but rather a collective investment in maintaining the appearance that religious institutions preserve rather than transform divine reality. Addressing this pattern would mean questioning not just specific theological details, but the very role of religious institutions in mediating transcendent possibility, a prospect simultaneously liberating and threatening to both individuals and institutions built around traditional religious frameworks. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche offers a penetrating insight into this collective avoidance. The falseness of a judgment is not necessarily an objection to a judgment. The question is, to what extent it is life-promoting, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps even species-cultivating. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that beliefs persist not primarily because of their truth value, but because of their psychological and social utility. And few systems are more psychologically and socially useful than those that claim to mediate divine reality. By maintaining the appearance that religious institutions preserve rather than transform divine presence, we avoid confronting the disturbing possibility that God has been killed largely through his institutional domestication. Religious institutions have an obvious stake in maintaining the appearance that they preserve rather than transform divine reality. Their authority depends fundamentally on their claim to represent God rather than to replace him, to transmit divine truth rather than to construct it, to facilitate divine encounter rather than to regulate it. Acknowledging that institutional mediation inevitably transforms the very divine reality it claims to represent would undermine this foundational claim, challenging not just specific theological details, but the very basis of religious institutional authority. It's not that religious leaders consciously suppress this insight, but rather that their entire framework depends on maintaining the appearance that institutions preserve rather than transform divine reality. Cultural narratives reinforce this pattern by consistently portraying religious institutions as preservers rather than transformers of divine presence. From religious education to popular culture, dominant stories present institutional religion as transmitting rather than constructing divine truth, as facilitating rather than regulating spiritual experience, as preserving rather than domesticating transcendent mystery. It's not a conscious conspiracy, but rather the natural evolution of cultural narratives that benefit from maintaining the appearance that religious institutions preserve, rather than transform divine reality. Educational systems often perpetuate this pattern by teaching religious history primarily as transmission of divine truth rather than progressive institutional transformation of spiritual experience. As Nietzsche writes in Human, All Too Human, all the visions, terrors, exhaustions, and raptures of the saint were well-known states of illness which, based on deeply rooted errors, he merely interpreted differently, that is, not as illnesses. This insight reveals how religious education might serve not just to transmit specific theological content, but to maintain the appearance that religious institutions preserve rather than transform divine reality. That spiritual experience has been historically mediated rather than progressively domesticated by institutional religion. Perhaps most significantly, this pattern remains unacknowledged, because addressing it would mean confronting what Nietzsche called the death of God, not merely questioning specific religious beliefs, but recognizing how thoroughly divine reality has been transformed through its institutional mediation. This prospect is so challenging that many prefer the familiar comfort of institutionally mediated religion to the more demanding terrain of spiritual understanding beyond traditional frameworks. The pattern persists not through conscious suppression, but through the simple human preference for comforting religious narratives over disturbing cultural insights, for divine reality that can be institutionally accessed over transcendent possibility that might require direct engagement, and for spiritual understanding that can be officially transmitted over divine encounter that might emerge beyond institutional mediation. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. This isn't mere atheistic declaration, but profound cultural observation. Even as living divine reality becomes increasingly inaccessible through institutional mediation, religious institutions continue displaying its shadow, the conceptual remnants of what was once immediate spiritual experience. What does this mean for the possibility of authentic spiritual understanding in a world where traditional conceptions of God have become increasingly unbelievable? If God has been killed largely through his institutional domestication, what might become possible if we sought spiritual understanding beyond institutional mediation? What aspects of divine reality might again become accessible if we distinguished between God himself and the institutions claiming to represent him? What form of spiritual life might emerge beyond the theological systems that have both preserved and distorted our conception of transcendent possibility? As we approach our final exploration, we'll examine what Nietzsche's discovery reveals about the possibility of authentic spiritual understanding beyond institutional mediation, not through rejection of divine reality, but through liberation from the systems that have both preserved and distorted our conception of that reality. The final question isn't whether God exists, but whether divine reality might again become accessible beyond its institutional domestication. Nietzsche's discovery reveals something profound about religious history, how consistently the institutionalization of spiritual experience coincides with the gradual receding of direct divine encounter. But it also reveals something even more significant, the possibility of authentic spiritual understanding beyond institutional mediation, not through rejection of divine reality, but through liberation from the systems that have both preserved and distorted our conception of that reality. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche articulates this possibility through his concept of the overman, not a superior being in the crude biological sense, but a way of approaching life beyond the constraints of traditional frameworks. I teach you the overman. Man is something that shall be overcome. And this isn't rejection of spiritual possibility, but recognition that authentic divine encounter might emerge beyond the theological systems that have both preserved and distorted our conception of transcendent reality, not through institutional mediation, but through direct engagement with life in all its complexity and contradiction. This isn't about embracing atheism or rejecting spiritual possibility, but transforming how we understand divine reality itself, recognizing that authentic spiritual understanding might emerge not through institutional mediation, but through direct engagement with lived experience. Perhaps the truly spiritual person isn't one who accepts institutionally approved doctrine, but one who encounters transcendent possibility directly, not through theological abstraction, but through immediate awareness, not through institutional mediation, but through authentic engagement with the mystery at the heart of existence. What might this look like in practice? It means examining your relationship to religious institutions, noticing when they function not to facilitate divine encounter, but to regulate and control access to transcendent reality. It means asking whether your conception of God emerges from direct spiritual experience or from institutionally approved teaching. It means recognizing when you use phrases like God says or the Bible teaches, not to express living spiritual insight, but to invoke institutional authority that displaces direct divine encounter. It means developing an approach to transcendent reality beyond institutional mediation, not through rejection of spiritual possibility, but through direct engagement with the mystery at the heart of existence. It means approaching divine reality not primarily through theological abstraction, but through lived human experience in all its complexity and contradiction. It means recognizing the possibility of spiritual understanding that emerges not through institutional approval, but through authentic engagement with life itself. Most importantly, it means understanding that liberation from institutional religion doesn't require rejection of divine reality, that authentic spiritual possibility might emerge precisely through the death of institutionally mediated God. This isn't abandonment of transcendent reality, but its rediscovery beyond the theological systems that have both preserved and distorted our conception of that reality. The path forward isn't about rejecting God, but liberating divine possibility from its institutional domestication. Whether within traditional religious frameworks or beyond them, authentic spiritual understanding requires distinguishing between divine reality itself and the institutions claiming to represent it, between transcendent mystery and the theological systems that have both preserved and distorted our conception of that mystery. What might become possible if you distinguished between God himself and the institutions claiming to represent him? What aspects of divine reality might again become accessible beyond institutional mediation? What form of spiritual understanding might you discover beyond the theological systems that have both preserved and distorted your conception of transcendent possibility? The answer to these questions won't come from more perfect theological system, but from direct engagement with the mystery at the heart of existence. As Nietzsche suggests, authentic spiritual understanding begins precisely where institutional mediation ends, with recognition that God is dead, not as rejection of divine reality, but as liberation from its institutional domestication. Perhaps the most profound insight isn't that God doesn't exist, but that divine reality has been systematically obscured by the very institutions claiming to represent it, and that authentic spiritual possibility might again become accessible when we distinguish between God himself and the conceptual systems constructed around him. The real journey isn't preserving institutionally mediated God, but discovering divine possibility beyond institutional domestication, not through rejection of transcendent reality, but through engagement with it beyond the theological systems that have both preserved and distorted our conception of that reality. Perhaps, as Nietzsche discovered, the most liberating spiritual truth of all is that God didn't die of natural causes. He was killed by the Church, and authentic divine encounter might again become possible beyond the institutional framework that claimed his death as necessity while causing it in reality.